people. Esther here with what I hope will be a fairly brief and straightforward look at the 3 tarot decks that have now been put out by the wonderful Kristen Condor and William Rader at Artisan Tarot. 3 different Tarot de Marseille, very important Tarot de Marseille decks, and they have a plan, I think, for 2 more decks to come out. I've said this before and I will say it again. Artisan Tarot right now is producing the best Tarot de Marseille for the practitioner, bar none, of all the Tarot de Marseille reproductions out there. Their attention to historical detail is great. The line work and coloring they do is impeccable. The production quality is lovely. Their tuck boxes are really nice tuck boxes. But what makes these decks such a standout is actually their cardstock, which is linen, and it is among the best linen cardstock out there. It rivals the expert playing card company cardstock out of Taiwan. Maybe that is who they use as their production folks. It's really good. It's really flexible. It just is such a delight. So, you have a beautifully restored deck, which once you put in your hands, you want to shuffle and read it. So these are decks that are made not just for the collector or the tarot historian, but for the tarot practitioner. And they're beautiful. I love them. I'm in love with them. And I love my Jean Fournet version. I have the Jean Noblet and the Jean Dodal in Flournoise reproductions, and those are gorgeous. I love my Yoav Ben-Dov version of the Conver. It's also gorgeous. These are great decks. But the cardstock on the Artisan Tarot, it's fabulous. And Kristen and William are really committed to getting a new generation of people who are just coming to the tarot, perhaps, interested in these historic decks. They are committed to spreading and disseminating this love for working with the Marseille lineage. To that end, they are giving away, you just pay $8, at least in the continental US, I'm not sure what it costs internationally, but $8 for shipping for a copy of the trumps from the Noblet Tarot. It also includes this title card of the 2 of coins. This itself is an amazing thing to work with, and I will have other videos in which I show how to use just a trump deck. Kasia Tarot Map, she's been talking about Tarot de Marseille in a beautiful way for years, and she has some beautiful work on working with trump cards. Tom Benjamin, of course, his channel, he talks and has taught and has written on reading the Marseille. There's wonderful people out there to guide you. All the classics, Camelia Elias, Yoav Ben-Dov, Jodorowsky, Alejandro Jodorowsky. I'll put stuff in my description to point you toward these people. There is a lot of resource out there. And now there are decks that I think really want to be in your hands. But I wanted to show these 3 decks side by side. And there may be other videos. When I was looking for this a few weeks ago, I couldn't find a video that looks at all 3 decks. But I wanted to do this because I wanted to talk specifically about the ways in which the Noblet and the Dodal, 1650 and 1701, these 2 decks, right, represent one variant within the Tarot de Marseille lineage, what's called, and this is a nomenclature that goes back to the mid-80s and the work of Thierry Depoly. It's called the Type 1 Tarot de Marseille versus the Conver, which is the tarot deck that really became the kind of exemplar for the Tarot de Marseille. It's the version that the Grimaud Publishing Company in France produced. So it's the Tarot de Marseille that, Sylvia Plath had a Grimaud tarot deck, in her collection. It's the tarot deck that influenced people like Jodorowsky, right? It's the tarot deck that really was persuasive for the 19th and 20th century occultists and tarot readers. And it's a type 2. And there's some decisive differences between type 1 and type 2 that are really interesting. So let's just go through these decks. And I'm not going to spend a lot of time. You know, I want to point out a few things. The Noblet 1650, I mean, I believe this is the earliest existing full, complete sample of what we would call the Tarot de Marseille style. You know, this is an incredible deck, right? I mean, you know, you see what's really at stake with the fool in his folly, right? This is about exposure and risk, right? And this creature, cat, I guess, it looks like a cat in the Tarot de Marseille. It gets a little bit more ambiguous as time goes on. You know, yeah, with your pants down and your junk exposed, all hell can break loose. And then we get the, I love the Noblet. Their penis is everywhere. What is going on with the wand? So, you know, you start to see some of the underlying kind of archetypal stuff at stake in the Tarot de Marseille and the coloring. The first difference I want to point out, though, about the type 1 and type 2 is in the name of the first card, which is the Fool, as opposed to le mat, the crazy person. So, you know, fou or folle, that's a type 1 designation, okay? And we'll just keep going. I have to say that of these three decks, the Dodal has always been my favorite. The expressiveness, the sweetness of the faces. There's just something, right? I mean, just look at those eyes. Things feel a little bit more, I'm just going to scooch everything over a little bit, get things more centered. Things feel a little bit more, I don't know, sort of stern and sedate. The color palette, and I really love this about the Artisan Tarot version, the color palette is also super pleasing. But the Noblet, I mean, it's fantastic. Okay, let's keep going forward. You know, there's small differences. I like the difference in the eyes. You know, that the kind of worry on the Empress's eyes here, the fatigue on this one, her frontal expression, her sideways glance, which also gets repeated. The sideways glance becomes a kind of mark of this figure. Even though the type 1 is usually associated with this feature, it's not in the Noblet, but that 4 that is hovering in front of the Emperor's face, which allows us to see the ways in which his very posture repeats the stability and fourness. And it brings to light something that's always of interest to me, which is the relationship between these Roman numerals, which have a different relationship to how we represent number, and the Arabic numerals. And it's right there in the Emperor. The triple cross comes into the type 2, but in the type 1, we don't have it. We have this weird fluttery thing that the Pope is holding. So that's interesting. That's an interesting difference. And then there are differences, you know, small differences, right? Regional differences, what's happening with the hands of the acolytes. But that fact that the triple cross isn't a part of the Pope is a marker of type 1. This is a really important change. Cupid, right, is flying in from the right, and he's blindfolded. So that blindfolded, you know, there's something about the way in which this card both is and isn't about choice. Like, you know, are we free to choose? To what extent is our desire our own? To what extent does it happen to us? And if even the God of love is blind, then, you know, who's calling the shots here, right? Whereas by the time we get 1760, is that right? I'm confused now, 1750, 1760. By the time we get to the Conver, 1760, I believe, Cupid knows exactly what he's doing and is coming in from the left. This is a small change, but the scallops on the chariots, whatever, the top of the chariot itself, the fact that the shield is empty, that's a type 1 variant. I love to look at where the eyes in the Dodal are looking. So I love the fact that the horse on the left, who, if you think about the Waite Smith imagery, this is going to be the Black Sphinx. So the sort of the more difficult horse. And in the Noblet, we do have that color difference. That this one's looking at that one. There's a way in which where the eyes are looking and how we're drawn and where we're, the ways in which these decks seem to be so much about where do we direct our gaze? How do we define our will? And the charioteer in the Noblet, where is he looking? So how do we move forward? Where do we direct our gaze? What are we looking at? And things get just a little bit more straightforward, it feels to me, by the Conver. The Conver, when I look at these historic decks, the Conver looks less interesting to me. And just the scallop gets replaced with a curtain. Justice. Again, just keeping in mind what we were saying about where folks are looking. Where is the Hermit looking? He seems to be looking directly at his light in all three images, and that seems to me important. He's not looking at where the light is illuminating. I have COVID brain, guys. I can't think straight. I'm still recovering from the crud. I love the depiction of these weird animals. They're really kind of what they are is kind of ambiguous. This looks clearly like a donkey, but what gets more clearly depicted as a monkey by the Conver is more ambiguous early on. Strength. So beautiful. The expressiveness in the Dodal, again, is really, really fabulous. This is an important marker of the type 1. So the hanged man, the hanged person, his tongue is sticking out and his hands are above his shoulders, right? What the hell does that mean? If historically this figure is an image of Judas, of the traitor, then that tongue sticking out could be a kind of, cosmic raspberry, like fuck you to the world, could be a sign of death, could be a sign of folly. But given the way in which the emperor illustrated so profoundly the Arabic numeral 4, we can't help but see the upside down 4 in the hanged man's leg. So something about power and control is really pointed to here. And then these hands, what the heck? So, things get way more straightforward by the time we get to this hanged man. The sense that we make of these changes is entirely ours. And how you want to understand the difference in a global sense between type 1 and type 2, that I think is worthy of exploration. And maybe, I think I've talked about it in an early video, like years ago, but I don't remember what I said. So that might be worth revisiting. This isn't a type 1 marker, but it's interesting to see that death is facing the other direction. Jodorowsky and Ben-Dov, who was Jodorowsky's student, are, really known for their focus on position, right? The positioning and gesture and where the figures are facing in this iconography as being an important part of reading the characters. The boobies in Dodal's Temperance is not a particular feature of type 2, but it is quite distinct to the Dodal Tarot. Now this is a type 2, or a type 1 I meant to say, with my reference to the boobies. This is a type 1 feature. The belly, that kind of hell's mouth imagery in the belly of the devil, right? Again, the Noblet lays it all out. You know, doesn't mince words here. We're talking about you know, yonis and lingams. But we also have that frankness in the Conver and a kind of pretty straightforward sexual ambiguity. I love the colors in this Noblet. There's something really creepy about the flesh in the Noblet, like the way in which it looks like these figures are wearing flesh suits. It kind of is what it is, but it's super creepy and wonderful. The moon in the type 1 Marseille is facing straight forward as opposed to being in profile. So less of an evocation of the waxing and waning, and more, I think, from my standpoint, particularly given the sexual ambiguity, the non-binary reality of the devil, I think that what this calls to is the way the moon carries the sun in it, as opposed to the more kind of mythologically correct and precise vision of the moon as waxing and waning. So it's sort of like, you know, is this moon, is this sun? The thing that's scary about the moon is that it's both, that it's non-binary, right? That's what's scary, is what's non-binary. And essentially the iconography in the sun card is the same. But again, the weirdness of these flesh suits. Right? Okay. And then Judgment, essentially the same. But, you know, things get tidied up. At least, you know, I find this imagery so much more profound than this imagery. This feels like, ho-hum, we're into the 18th century. Things make sense. This is still like, oh, the world is weird. The world is weird. And this is, yeah, the world is really weird. And finally, there's one more difference, but this is, to my mind, the critical difference between type 1 and type 2 Marseille, that the world card still evokes Christ at the center, that the world dancer, that this is an image of Christ surrounded by the 4 Gospels. This is about the completion of Alpha and Omega, the completion that is God's incarnation, man and God being joined. Whereas here, she's a lady, right? We've kind of distanced ourselves from the weird kind of Christian symbolism of this card. Now, it's a little bit more ambiguous in the Noblet, so people have pointed here too to the kind of non-binary presentation of this figure, and I think that also is appropriate, but that also, to my mind, is Christ, because in the iconography of Jesus, there's so many ways in which Jesus' mother appears with almost as great intensity as a masculine presenting understanding of Jesus. So, the only other major difference with these decks comes in the court cards and in the ways in which, when we get to the knight, he's called a chevalier as opposed to a cavalier. So that's the only other major difference. And, you know, there's oops, well, these are a little bit slidey, these cards. You know, we can look at the difference in the colors. And other more minor differences in the flourishes. But the color palette, when we get past the majors, the color palette and the arrangement of the elements, especially the arrangement of the flourishes, mostly remains the same. Some differences. The Dodal is sometimes a little bit more centered, a little bit less pushing out toward the ends. There's some differences with, whether flourishes are connected or not. I love this 9 in the Noblet with its complete blossoming. But, bottom line, these cards are more similar in the pips than they're different. Some differences with where characters are looking in the courts. The art style is, this is why I find the Conver less interesting. The art style is more refined. There's just this quirkiness. I love the contrast with the backgrounds and the horse, this black ground underneath the paler blue of the horse is just, it's just beautiful to my eye. I love the bulbous faces, these huge eyes, and there's just a sweetness. And this King of Coins, he's one of my favorite depictions of this card. He just looks so loving. There's a kind of sweetness, again, I think I've used that word a million times, to the Dodal. There's more gray in the Noblet. I'm just pointing out things that are obvious here, right off the, you notice it right off the bat. It's sort of interesting to me how much this looks like it's going through or where it looks like it's not going through as much. That kind of penetration through the center is something that we're meant to notice in the Marseille deck. What's happening at the center, what's happening in the perimeter. When it comes to reading the pips, that's where the action is, in the relationship between the center and the perimeter, the corners and the sides. And the flourishes help articulate that contrast between center and perimeter. And just this tendency to make 10, to bring to light the 2 piercing through. So 10s, if you notice, this is for another video, but if you notice the way in which the difference between an even number and an odd number is whether things cut through the middle or not, then 10 kind of resolves that problem by cutting through the middle with 2. So 10s really culminate the relationship between even and odd, if that makes any sense. One thing that I did want to point out, there's a misnumbering in the Dodal. That is not in the Noblet. And I'm sure that Kristen and William did this, that they're just repeating what happens in the historical deck. So the Dodal, but I don't remember reading about this, and I don't have my Fleur Noire handy to see if it's repeated there. But notice how the Roman numeral here is 4, not 6, but it's 6. Notice how the Roman numeral here, that's not a number, right? It's inverted. So there must have been some either confusion or historic variation on how you depict the numbers after 5. Like, what do you do with that 5? Do you put the 1 in front of it or behind it? And that doesn't appear in the Conver or the Noblet. Okay, we're really into minutiae now. I'll just quickly go through all 3 decks. Boobies. You gotta love the boobies and the flesh clothes. I have to say I'm a big fan of the coloring in the Noblet, in the cups. I just think it's gorgeous. There are basically 2 title cards in these decks. At least in the Dodal and the Noblet, you get a title card in the 2 of Cups and also in the 2 of Pentacles. Really important, I think, to notice the ways, and this is something that's really important when you're working with Tarot de Marseille for readings, to notice the standardization of where the pip elements are placed. There are a lot of ways to place 5 cups Well, there probably aren't a lot of ways. There are a lot of ways to play 7 cups. And there's a consistency here in how that works within the Tarot de Marseille. Oops, this one's upside down. Oh. Okay. All right, I think I'm getting behind here. Now, this isn't something I've read as a difference between type 1 and type 2, but it's certainly a difference between the Noblet and the Dodal and the Conver, which is whether the Valet de Coupe, the Page of Cups, whether the cup is covered or not. And you can sort of see how you might want to have a fish coming out of the cup based on the Conver symbolism. Again, the kings tend to be so sweet in the Dodal, and they look a little bit sterner in other versions. The flourishes tell us what are reversals in these cards, as do the placement of the swords. The swords should be pointing up. So, you know, it's important to realize that pip cards can have reversals too. It doesn't mean we need to read them that way. But there's a difference between the Tarot de Marseille pips and, say, a standard playing card deck where we might not always be able to tell what's right side up and what's upside down. Okay, so there you have it, folks. Look how young this King of Swords looks. Yeah, there you have it. The Noblet, the Dodal, and the Conver. And I completely forgot to talk about the backs of these decks. But the design is also what's on the box itself. The Conver, the Dodal, pardon my shadows here, and the Noblet. Very simple, black and a kind of cream off-white, quite pleasing, historically accurate, and very well suited to the decks. 3 amazing productions by the wonderful folks at Artisan Tarot. And by the way, they sent me to review, they sent me the Conver. I'd already purchased the other 2 decks, and they also included this fabulous pin. So I just can't thank them enough. But yeah, amazing decks. I guess that's all. Thank you guys so much for watching, as always. Thank you for your practice.